You need to understand something that many people never truly realize until they have already given too much of themselves, and that is the quiet moment when an empath finally detaches is not a moment of revenge, it is not a moment of bitterness, and it is certainly not a moment of cruelty. It is the moment when a heart that loved deeply finally decides that its own peace deserves protection. For a long time, the empath in a relationship often becomes the person who carries the emotional weight for both people. They become the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who explains feelings again and again, even when those feelings are ignored or misunderstood. They become the one who says, maybe they are just scared, or maybe they just need more time, or maybe if I love them a little better, they will finally feel safe enough to stay close. And you need to understand how powerful that kind of love is. Empaths do not love halfway. When they care about someone, they care deeply. They notice the small changes in someone's voice. They feel the silence behind short messages. They sense when something is wrong even when no one says a word. They give patience when others would walk away. They give compassion when others would become angry. They try to see the wounds behind someone's distance instead of only reacting to the pain it causes them. That is the beauty of an empath's heart. But sometimes that beauty becomes the very reason they stay too long in situations that slowly drain them. Because when someone with an avoidant nature enters this kind of dynamic, a quiet pattern can begin to form. Avoidant people often survive relationships by controlling distance. When emotions become intense, they pull away. When vulnerability appears, they create space. When expectations grow, they suddenly become quiet or distracted or unavailable. Sometimes it is not done with bad intentions, sometimes it comes from their own fear of being overwhelmed by closeness. But regardless of the reason, the result often looks the same. Distance appears exactly when connection is needed most. And when that distance appears, the empath responds with more effort. They send longer messages. They try to explain their feelings clearly. They ask gentle questions. They reassure the other person that everything will be okay. They become the emotional bridge holding the connection together. Every time the avoidant steps back, the empath steps forward. Every time silence appears, the empath fills it with hope. Every time confusion grows, the empath tries to solve it with understanding. For a while, this pattern can continue quietly, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The avoidant becomes used to the empath's patience. They become comfortable knowing that even if they pull away for a while, the connection will still be there when they return. They may not say it out loud, they may not even realize it consciously, but somewhere inside they know that the empath will still be there trying to fix the distance. But something important slowly begins to change inside the empath's heart. It does not change suddenly. It does not begin with anger or shouting or dramatic endings. It begins with exhaustion, a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who never quite meets you in the same place emotionally. The empath begins to notice that they are always the one reaching out first. They notice that their needs are often postponed so that the other person can stay comfortable. They notice that they are constantly adjusting themselves, trying to be calmer, easier, less emotional, less demanding, just so the other person will not disappear again. And eventually, a painful realization begins to grow. The empath realizes that love should not feel like a constant attempt to prove their worth. Love should not feel like walking on emotional eggshells, hoping that honesty will not scare the other person away. Love should not require someone to shrink their needs just to keep someone else from running. This realization does not turn the empath cold. It does something much more powerful than that. It makes them honest with themselves. For the first time, they begin to ask a different question. Not, how can I make this work? But why am I the only one trying this hard to make it work? And once that question becomes clear, the answer becomes impossible to ignore. So the empath slowly begins to detach. Not with anger, not with blame, but with quiet clarity. They stop chasing conversations that never happen. They stop explaining feelings that are repeatedly dismissed. They stop reopening doors that someone else keeps closing. They begin to place their emotional energy somewhere else, somewhere healthier, somewhere calmer. And this is where the shift becomes powerful, because the empath's detachment changes the entire emotional structure of the relationship. The avoidant, who was once comfortable controlling the distance, suddenly feels something unfamiliar. The pattern they relied on no longer works. Before, distance would activate the empath's effort. Silence would trigger a message. Withdrawal would trigger patience and understanding, but now the empath is no longer responding the same way. Now the silence remains silence. And you need to understand why this moment is so shocking for the avoidant. It is not simply that the empath left, it is that the empath stopped chasing. The emotional safety net that once existed is suddenly gone. The person who once fought to keep the connection alive is now protecting their own heart instead. This is why empath detachment can feel so overwhelming to someone who is used to emotional distance. Because the empath was never just another partner in the relationship, they were the emotional center holding everything together. When they step back, the entire structure shifts. But the most important truth in all of this is not about the avoidant at all. The most important truth is about the empath. Because detachment is not the loss of love, it is the return of self-respect. It is the moment someone realizes that loving another person should never require abandoning themselves. The empath does not detach because they stopped caring. They detach because they finally understand that caring about someone else should never cost them their peace, their dignity, and their emotional safety. And once that understanding becomes real, something beautiful begins to happen inside them. They begin to feel lighter. They begin to feel calmer. They begin to realize that their heart was never too much. It was simply given to someone who could not hold it properly. And when an empath finally protects their heart instead of sacrificing it, that is not cruelty. That is healing. You need to understand something that most people rarely see until they are standing in the quiet aftermath of a relationship, and that is the way an avoidant personality often feels safe when someone else, an empath, keeps reaching, keeps forgiving, and keeps trying to hold the emotional space for both of them, because that safety is built on predictability, on the knowledge that no matter how far they pull away, someone will still be there waiting, still explaining, still carrying the connection, still softening the edges of distance with patience and love. For years, the avoidant can rely on this pattern without even realizing it, because it becomes second nature to them to step back when things get too real or too intense, to retreat when vulnerability appears, and to detach when emotions rise, all while knowing the empath will do the work of bridging the gap, of translating their silence into meaning, of filling their absence with understanding. And you need to understand how deeply this dynamic shapes both hearts. The empath, in their incredible capacity to care, notices the small cracks, the subtle tension, the shifts in tone and energy, and they step in to smooth it, to reassure, to make the other feel safe, even when their own heart is heavy, even when their needs are unmet, even when their patience is being tested again and again. They give without hesitation, they forgive without condition, they hope without expectation, because hope is the lens through which they see love, and love to them is patient, understanding, and relentless in its willingness to hold space for another. But while this love is beautiful, it can also quietly erode the empath's sense of self over time. Because when someone else's safety depends entirely on you, when someone else's comfort is maintained by your constant presence, your constant effort, your constant explanation, you start to notice a shift inside yourself. You start to realize that your energy is being drained in a pattern that never fully reverses, that your hope is not being reciprocated, and that your heart is giving more than it is receiving. The avoidant in this scenario does not feel pressure. They feel relief because the predictability of the empath's devotion allows them to maintain their distance without consequence. They know that even if they disappear, even if they pull away, someone will still be there, trying, reaching, and hoping. And you need to understand how powerful that realization is when it finally arrives in the empath's consciousness. At first, the empath may try harder, as they always do. They may send longer messages, try to explain more clearly, offer more compassion, stretch their patience beyond its limits, because leaving is not an instinct. Staying and hoping is. They may think, if I just give more love, if I just care more, if I just understand better, they will finally stay close. But slowly, quietly, the empath begins to feel the truth that has always been there. The avoidance distance is not a sign of something missing in the empath's love. It is a reflection of the other person's inability to stay emotionally present consistently, and no amount of effort or patience will change that. And you need to understand the heartbreak of this realization, because it is not dramatic, it is not explosive, it is quiet, it is soft, it is the kind of pain that comes from seeing your love invested in someone who cannot meet you in the same way. Every act of patience that was once a gift begins to feel like a weight. Every explanation that was once a bridge begins to feel like a trap. Every moment of hope begins to feel like a slow erosion of self-worth. The empath begins to notice the pattern for what it is. They are always the one giving, always the one seeking clarity, always the one bridging the emotional gap, and always the one left wondering if their love is enough to make someone stay. And then, something shifts. It may not be a sudden shift. It may start with a small boundary, a pause in communication, a quiet refusal to fill the void that has been left empty for so long. The empath begins to step back, not in anger, not in revenge, not in spite, but in quiet clarity, because they finally understand that their heart deserves to be protected, and that protecting their heart is not betrayal, it is survival, it is self-respect, it is the acknowledgement that love cannot flourish where emotional safety is absent. This is the moment the avoidant often cannot comprehend fully, because they have relied on the pattern for so long. They have relied on the predictability of the empath's effort to maintain distance without consequence. Now the pattern has been broken. The bridge is no longer there. The safety net has disappeared. The person who once explained, forgave, and softened the distance is now choosing themselves instead, and that quiet detachment shakes the avoidant because it is unfamiliar, because it is real, because it cannot be controlled or predicted. And you need to understand what happens inside the empath during this detachment. They feel the ache of loss, the sting of absence, the tenderness of love that still lingers, and yet they also feel the relief of reclaiming themselves. They start to notice their energy returning, their thoughts becoming clearer, their emotions less burdened by someone else's avoidance. They start to breathe more freely because they no longer have to carry the emotional weight for two people. They start to recognize their own worth not as something to be proven through patience and sacrifice, but as something inherent, untouchable, and deserving of reciprocity. It is in this moment, when detachment is complete, that the empath's power becomes visible. It is not power in the sense of domination or control. It is the power of self-respect, the power of emotional clarity, the power of returning to oneself without apology. And you need to understand why this power is so difficult for the avoidant to face. Because for years they have survived by controlling distance, by creating a predictable emotional environment, and by knowing someone else will always hold the space for them. When that safety is gone, they are confronted with the full weight of their choices, with the reality that they cannot pull someone back simply by remaining distant. They must meet the other person on equal terms or accept the loss. And that is why empath detachment shakes the avoidant so profoundly. It is not about anger. It is not about punishment. It is not about drama. It is about clarity. It is about consequence. It is about a quiet, unshakable boundary that demonstrates the empath's value, the empath's dignity, and the empath's refusal to allow their heart to be a tool for someone else's avoidance. The avoidant feels the loss, but the empath feels their own freedom. They feel the return of their own energy. They feel the reassurance that they are enough without having to overgive. They feel the quiet victory of finally aligning their actions with their self-respect. And you need to understand that this is not bitterness. It is not cruelty. It is not the end of love. It is the evolution of love, the recognition that caring for someone else must never come at the cost of caring for yourself. It is the moment an empath becomes whole again, and that is the quiet, undeniable power that an avoidant cannot control, cannot predict, and often cannot fully understand. It is the moment where self-respect replaces sacrifice, where clarity replaces confusion, where love becomes something that nurtures rather than drains, and where the empath finally feels safe in the one place they should always have felt safe, within themselves. You need to understand the quiet power of boundaries, the way they feel like a small step at first, almost invisible, almost insignificant, but over time they reshape everything inside you and around you, because setting a boundary is not about punishment. It is not about revenge. It is not about making someone feel small. It is about honoring yourself in a world that has taught you to put others first, to soften your voice, to shrink your needs, to apologize for wanting love the way it was meant to be given. For far too long, people with avoidant tendencies have relied on the predictability of someone who always forgives, someone who always waits, someone who always absorbs the distance without complaint. And that predictability creates a kind of emotional power that is rarely acknowledged, a power that the avoidant uses unconsciously, sometimes intentionally, to feel safe without having to show up fully. And you need to understand how that affects the person on the receiving end, the empath, the one whose heart is naturally large, whose capacity to care is deep, whose instinct is to nurture and to protect, even when it is themselves who are at risk. At first, the empath believes that their love can bridge gaps, can soften defenses, can heal wounds that are hidden beneath the armor of distance. They believe that patience, compassion, and consistent effort will be enough to create connection, to create intimacy, to make someone feel safe enough to step closer rather than retreat. And for a time, that belief sustains them, gives them purpose, fills their days with hope, and keeps their heart open, even when it is being tested in ways that feel exhausting. But slowly, the empath begins to notice a pattern that is impossible to ignore. They begin to notice that the love they give is rarely met with the same consistency, that the care they pour into the relationship is often absorbed without reciprocity, that every small act of effort is counterbalanced by silence, distance, or detachment. They begin to notice that their boundaries, if they exist at all, have been ignored, tested, or dismissed, and that their emotional labor has been taken for granted because the avoidant has become used to it. And you need to understand how quietly devastating that can be, because it is not a moment of grand betrayal, it is a slow erosion of trust, a gradual wearing down of the belief that love should feel mutual, safe, and sustaining. The empath may try again and again to restore balance, sending careful messages, offering clarity, seeking understanding, and hoping that this time the other person will meet them halfway. They may soften their words, stretch their patience, adjust their own needs, and try to accommodate the discomfort of another as if their own comfort is less important. And each time they do this, a part of them whispers that this is not sustainable, that they are bending for someone who refuses to meet them with the same openness, that the pattern cannot be fixed by their effort alone. And yet, they continue because love to an empath is relentless, it is forgiving, it is willing to stay when others leave, and it is patient in ways that defy exhaustion. And you need to understand the moment when an empath finally realizes that boundaries are not a betrayal, but a necessity. It is the moment they see clearly that no amount of patience will change a pattern that is deeply ingrained, that the other person cannot give the consistency they need without being willing to step fully into emotional presence. It is the moment they understand that protecting their heart does not make them unloving. It makes them courageous. It makes them strong. It makes them capable of surviving love without losing themselves. And when that moment arrives, the empath begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, withdrawing just a little, choosing not to over-explain, choosing not to chase, choosing not to rescue a heart that has been trained to remain distant. This shift, this quiet strengthening of boundaries, is what confuses and unsettles the avoidant. They are used to control through distance, to safety through predictability, to freedom from pressure because someone else is always holding the emotional space for them. Suddenly, that safety net is gone. Suddenly, their familiar pattern no longer produces the comfort it once did. Suddenly, the empath is no longer responding in the way that guarantees their distance can exist without consequence. And you need to understand how terrifying this is for the avoidant, not because they are cruel, not because they are intentionally manipulative, but because they are suddenly facing the reality that the person they relied on will no longer absorb the distance, and they have no map for how to engage when that distance meets firmness instead of chasing. Meanwhile, the empath feels something powerful, something they may not have felt in a long time: freedom. They feel the weight of constant emotional labor lifting. They feel the clarity of their own needs no longer being negotiated into silence. They feel the relief of being allowed to protect their heart without guilt. They notice the energy returning to them, the ability to breathe without constantly adjusting for someone else's fear, the ability to hold their own emotional boundaries without apology or explanation. They begin to understand that love can exist without self-abandonment, that caring deeply does not mean sacrificing their peace, that standing firm is not cruelty, it is self-respect made visible. And you need to understand that the avoidant may react with confusion, with attempts to re-engage, with testing the waters to see if the old pattern can return. They may act as if nothing has changed. They may send small gestures. They may try to pull the empath back into familiar territory. But the empath has learned that their boundaries are not negotiable, that their heart cannot be used as a tool for someone else's comfort, that emotional labor cannot be given indefinitely without reciprocity. And in that steadfastness lies the true power of the empath, not the power to punish, but the power to protect, the power to love themselves with the same depth that they have always loved others, and the power to exist fully in their own emotional space, unshaken by the patterns of someone else's avoidance. It is here, in this quiet, authentic human act of boundary setting, that everything changes. The avoidant can no longer rely on predictability, the dynamic is broken, and the empath stands in their own strength. They do not need to shout, they do not need to explain, they do not need to chase. Their actions are clear, their heart is protected, their energy is reclaimed, and you need to understand that this is not a failure of love. It is the evolution of love, the moment when caring for another becomes balanced with caring for oneself, the moment when empathy transforms from overgiving into self-respecting, authentic presence, and the moment when both people, whether they realize it or not, are faced with the truth of emotional responsibility. Because love without boundaries is a kind of chaos, a slow erosion of self. And love with boundaries is the strongest kind of clarity, the kind that shocks the avoidant not with anger or drama, but with quiet dignity, with unwavering standards, and with the truth that a heart that has always given can also stand firm, can also protect itself, and can also return to its own wholeness. And in that wholeness lies a power no avoidance can predict, control, or diminish.